right. I am excited next to introduce Peter Delling. He is an investigative reporter, editor, and media manager from Budapest. He is one of Gabor's colleagues at 444, but he's joining us today to speak about his recent research as a Reuters Institute for Journalism Fellow at Oxford University. He just finished that fellowship up, and he spent that time studying audience revenue models in Central and Eastern Europe and the Global South. And Peter will share now a little bit more about his talk and present. Thanks, Peter.
Hi, thanks for having me. Let me try to share my screen too. Please nod if you can see it. All right, I assume you can see it. So I'm going to be talking about 7 lessons in audience revenues from challenging political environments. I work at 444.hu. We started in 2013, and we are one of the few remaining independent news outlets in Hungary. We have around 500,000 readers a day and 3 million a month. This is in a country of 9.8 million. And we began our audience revenue program in 2017. Now, when we started in 2013, our idea was to have 444 as sustained by advertising alone. But then in a few years, we realized that this was not going to happen for 2 reasons. One of the reasons is Facebook and Google and the big platform companies, and I think we are all aware of their disruptive effect on the digital advertising market. But on top of that, in Hungary, we have a government that is ready and willing to interfere with independent media. And one of the most important forms of interference is interference in the advertising market. The government is putting tremendous pressure on private advertisers not to advertise with independent newsrooms. So we realized that we'll need alternative sources of revenue, and audience revenues was a way for us to go. So we began building our audience revenue program slowly from 2017 on. But then the pandemic came along, and that changed everything, because almost overnight, last March, the digital advertising market collapsed, and we found ourselves, without money. We maybe had money for 3 months and had to start with this awful math of survival of, how many people do we lay off or whose salaries to cut. We ended up introducing progressive pay cuts throughout the organization, so we didn't lay anyone off. And then we turned to our audience and we told them openly that our survival is in their hands. And if they don't support our journalism, there will not be any 444 left. And we launched a donation drive, a crowdfunding campaign, and later on a very basic membership. And it really worked. Our audience responded big time. And we raised enough money so by the end of last summer, we could reverse all pandemic pay cuts. And by the end of the year, we hired 8 additional reporters and some other people. And we were profitable in 2020. So in 2021, as you said, I went to Oxford to the Reuters Institute to study audience revenue programs in challenging political environments like ours, basically to learn how to get affluent audiences to pay for public service journalism for all. 19 outlets from 16 countries took part in the study. All had digital audience revenue programs. All were independent. And these are 7 lessons. These are some of the lessons from my study. So the first lesson is about the path of least resistance. And actually, the path of least resistance is audience revenues. So I asked each newsroom about interference they faced around their newsroom and content and around their business. And you can see the results here. And what I found is that interference around newsrooms and content are in general a lot more common than interference around business. And when it comes to interference around business, most of the interference happens around advertising, putting pressure on advertisers not to spend money at the outlet. And there is very little direct interference with the outlet's ability to collect audience revenue. So I think this is very important because it shows that even in a challenging environment, if you are struggling to find sustainability, it's worth looking into audience revenues, because the state actors, the government, will interfere less there relatively. I'm not saying there's no interference. In the more repressive countries in my study, there were some interference, but still, this was the path of least resistance. The second lesson is about paywalls. Now, I think the biggest difference between sort of North America and Western Europe and the rest of the world when it comes to digital audience revenue programs is the existence of paywalls. In 2019, the Reuters Institute did a study. Over 200 outlets responded, and they asked whether they had paywalls operating, and 69% had it. Whereas in my study, only 36% of the outlet had active paywalls, despite all going for audience revenues. I think in the West, paywalls are a foregone conclusion if you want to get your audience to pay for your journalism. In Central and Eastern Europe and the Global South, it's very much up for debate. And so I asked the outlets who did not have paywalls why they didn't have them. And the most common answer was about having a paywall is not in line with the mission, that you need an audience to have an impact, and the paywall, will make that very difficult. I think one CEO of a South African outlet said that, it has to be about more than the profitability of the institution. It's about the mission, and the paywall is not in line with the mission. I think there's two sort of reasons for that, why this is the most important reason that they gave. One of it, these countries that I studied, they have high levels of unemployment. Some of them have very high levels of poverty. So having a subscription, even a tiny one, would be very restrictive. It would prohibit large parts of the population from accessing the content. And the other has to do with these environments being low choice. So if in a country there are only, very few independent media outlets who offer sort of quality, unbiased, nuanced journalism, then you putting your content behind the paywall is a very big decision, because there are not that many other outlets out there who do that. So all these concerns, I think, are perfectly legitimate, but financially speaking, paywalls seem to work even in these environments. So I asked about revenues also, and what you can see here on the left is that newsroom with the paywall have more, the share of audience revenues were larger than for the newsrooms without the paywall. And on the other side, you can see how it relates to content. Newsroom, which put most of their content behind the paywall, had relatively larger shares of audience revenue. So I think it shows that even in these environments, paywalls are an effective tool to drive audience revenues. Now, this was a very interesting part of the study for me, because it's very relevant for us at 444. This was about what do you put behind the paywall? And the answers point to a very conflicted dynamic. So on one hand, on the top of the chart, you can see exclusive reporting, long reads, other resource-intensive formats. Those are the things that editors felt strongly about putting them behind the paywall. And then on the bottom of the chart, you see public service journalism, stories about democracy and rule of law, or about corruption. Those are the things that editors wanted to keep free. But the problem here is that these categories overlap. So usually some of your exclusive and original reporting, some of your long reads are going to be about corruption and rule of law and public service journalism. So it shows how even the outlets with the paywalls are struggling to find a balance between their public service mission and then finding sustainability in audience revenues. The third thing I want to talk about is conversions and retention, and how those things, I think the motivation may be different in these environments. So I was really surprising that many editors I spoke to flat out told me that they believe that the benefits or services they offer as part of their audience revenue programs are largely meaningless to the audience. They told me that they believe that the audience buys in for the mission, buys in for the outlet, for the topics they cover, because they relate, they are important for their audience, but also more commonly or more generally because they believe that independent media is an integral part of democratic society, and they wanted to change that. I think there's an argument to be made that supporting independent media in these environments can be considered an act of personal political expression, because what happens is the avenues of political expression is very limited. You may not be able to criticize the government openly or on social media because you can get into trouble. You may feel that, well, you have a vote, you have elections, but they may not be free and fair. So what do you do? How can you express your political opinion? And supporting these independent media outlets can be one way, I think. Now, while conversions may be chiefly emotional, retention seems to be more transactional. And what this means is that initially, people may buy in for the mission alone, for what independent media represents for them in that environment. but they stay around if you offer them benefits that they regularly have got value out of. If you don't offer them something that they can, they can read or they can be a part of, then they will churn, they will cancel, they will not renew. This is what I found talking to these outlets. So what do people offer? What benefits they offer? This was a list. The top one is exclusive newsletters. I think it's very easy to figure out why they are fairly easy for the newsroom to produce. They are fairly easy to implement from a technical standpoint. There are lots of sort of easily accessible and not very expensive third-party tools. Email newsletters are not subject to algorithmic filtering. So if you send someone a newsletter, they are going to get it. And they fit into the news diets of the people who subscribe to digital news outlets. These are the people who tend to read their emails a lot. So, and then event invitations and providing an online forum, like a closed Facebook group for your audience to connect with your newsroom was the second and the third most important. Now, it was interesting to see how the number of benefits offered related to the existence of paywall. And I found that outlets without the paywall tended to offer more benefits than outlets with the paywall. And I think this is significant because it shows that if you offer content, exclusive content, many of the newsroom feel that's largely enough. But if you don't, I think newsrooms have this reflex to wanting to offer things to their audience. The problem here, or not the problem, but I think one thing that you have to be mindful of is that the other benefits, the non-exclusive content kind of benefits, also may put a strain in your newsroom. So for example, we at 4444 has a closed Facebook group with 7,000 members. It's fairly popular. I think people find it valuable. They can connect with our reporters and our editors. We organize AMAs and other stuff. But the thing is, this needs resources from the newsroom because the people are looking to connect with the reporters, with the editors, not a community manager. So you need to be mindful that these other benefits you may come up with, may also put a strain on the newsroom. Pricing disparities, I think this is fairly straightforward. I found over half charged $6 or less as an average monthly contribution. This is around half or less than a half of what the Western mainstream publication costs. And then the kind of payments you accept, credit cards and debit cards were king. Every single outlet in my study accepted those, and this is the list. I think one interesting thing to point out is how payment methods and repression relates to each other is about Russia. Some of the independent news outlets in Russia accept payment in crypto. Now, the general thinking, I think, is payments needs to be, seamless and frictionless, the easiest possible. But then you have these environments where the state itself considers supporting certain outlets an act of political expression and an act that they don't really like. So some of your audience may want to hide the fact that they support you, and crypto enables them to do that. But crypto is incredibly difficult. But then in some environments, if it's really repressive, it's worth exploring because for some of your audience, it may be the anonymity may be worth it. The 6 lessons around crowdfunding and how crowdfunding is for big projects only. They can get very resource intensive. So what I found is that crowdfunding, one article raising $1,000, it's not really worth it, especially since most of the crowdfunding is for one-time payments and you should always go for recurring payments. So it's only worth it if you are raising money for a really big thing, $20,000, $30,000, or over. That's when I think crowdfunding began sort of to make sense. It can be effective against certain types of interference, and I hope Pramesh will talk a little bit about that. And I think what's also worth mentioning that some of the crowdfunding mechanics can be used as a part of program promotion for recurring payments. So you can say, hey, we need to raise 200 new subscriptions by the end of the month and then tie some benefit to it. So if 200 new subscriptions happen, then all new subscribers will get some nice picture, or will hire someone else. But to use crowdfunding, because crowdfunding has its benefit, it has a certain appeal, it has momentum, but it's good to use it to drive recurring payments instead of one-time payments. And then the last lesson is about how to publicize, how to promote your program. And what I found here is that none of the outlets in the survey really promoted the financial value of their offering, discounts or cool services or what they're worth. Everybody spoke about either their unique quality journalism, their exclusive content, or the value of press freedom and independent journalism in general for a healthy society. And I think this, again, points to that mindset described earlier, how the mission is the most important things in these environments. Most of the promotion was done by an kept in-house, so either a dedicated marketer or the newsroom. Only one outlet said that they used an outside marketer. And the last point I wanted to make is about publicizing attacks and attempts at interference as a means of program promotion. So we've done that when we went to, early on in the pandemic, we went to a press briefing by the government spokesman. We asked some tough questions and we were told that, that they didn't like us. And then later on, some talking heads on TV, the pro-government TV, called for our arrest and that sort of stuff. And we made a video clip out of it and we used it to raise money, and it was really effective. But on the other hand, I think in some environments and in some cases, you have to be mindful of the risk this carries and how this may inadvertently politicize your work. So in Hungary, at least, one of the tenets how the government attacks independent media is basically to say there is no independent media. In fact, everybody is just a party political actor. We are just being dishonest about it. There's no such thing as independent journalism and so on. And I think if you publicize these attacks, you run into the risk of moving into this fear. It's easier for powerful actors to portray you as an activist or a political actor. That said, sometimes I think it's good to use this tool, but it carries certain risks. So you can read the full study or a short write-up, and I think at the end of the day, Ariel and the MPP folks were going to send you an email with the links to it. And now I would like to introduce you to Pramesh Chandran from Malaysia Kini. He's the CEO, the top news sites from Malaysia, and Carlos Salamanca from El Faro, El Salvador. And I think both of them can speak about, repressive environments and the effect these environments have on membership programs. And I want to turn to you, Pramesh, first and ask you about how your environment affected your audience revenue program. And more specifically, if you could talk about your successful crowdfunding campaigns that you used to counter some of the things that the government tried to use against you.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks. I found the study very interesting. Nice to see what happens in other similar repressive countries. I think we've had a long history of subscription over the last 19-20 years, and things have changed dramatically from the early days to now. There have been different phases. We also had a change of government in between, so that has also affected subscription. But by and large, you are right in the sense of that it's very much mission driven, and it is often an act of political expression for people to subscribe and to support Malaysia Kini. We recently, over the last couple of years, been able to tweak subscription a little bit to get the technology right, to get our our flow right, and that helped also grow subscription. Also, some of our competitors, we were the first to go subscription, but some of our competitors have also embarked on that road. So that really helps when you're not the only ones offering a subscription model, and there are other players in the market also becoming subscription. Like you said, for crowdfunding, it really helps when it's a specific project, a big project. I think the one that you were referring to was that earlier this year we had a big court case which went against us because of we were charged with contempt of court because some of our readers' comments, but the comment itself questioned the Chief Justice, and we were charged with contempt of court, and we were found guilty for those readers' comments and fined $500,000 ringgit, which is about $130,000 US. But we managed to raise that from our readers within 4 hours. So it was really a situation where people gave in order to show dissent against the judgment and to support Malaysia Kini as really an independent voice. And obviously, that also builds a lot of credibility, a lot of branding for Malaysia Kini. Thanks.
Thank you. And Carlos, the main question is same to you. How did the political environment affect your audience revenue programs? And more specifically, I think you have a great story about a televised press conference in which the president mentioned you and what kind of effect that had on your audience revenue program.
Thank you, Peter, and thanks for the invitation. Yeah, we started 2020 with around 300 members in our community, and the core work we used to do gave us around 20 to 25 new members every month. That was our acquisition rhythm, right? On September 24 of 2020, President Bukele stated in a public press conference that was seen nationwide that the Ministry of Finance was investigating El Faro for money laundering, which is absolutely false. And he dedicated a quarter of the whole 2-hour press conference to attack El Faro, to say we were criminals, to say we were rapists, to say we were money launderers, tax evaders, etc. Right? So after that press conference, we decided to focus on a very niche strategy with newsletters. We sent a lot of newsletters to the closer readers, and we got like 125 new members in the next following days, like 10 days around. So that allowed us to grow until 665 members after 2020, and currently we are, by focusing on that strategy, around 900. So we're pretty sure we will get to 1,000 this year.
I was wondering, and this is to you, Carlos, as well. As far as I know, you had concerns about how like regulation can sort of diminish your ability to collect audience revenue, because I think this is one of the concerns for many outlets here, that right now there is little interference with audience revenues, but one day the government going to figure out a way to interfere there. And I was wondering, can you talk about your concerns here and what's happening in El Salvador?
Yes, it happened last year that besides that accusation of the informal accusation of money laundering, we have been suffering a very aggressive audit up from the Ministry of Finances for 4 fiscal years of El Faro, 2014, 16, 17, and 18. So in that moment, in a moment last year, we received a request of information about the names and last names and emails of all the people who became members of El Faro in those years. We considered, and our lawyers considered, that information was far beyond the fiscal interest, because we already had given the invoices, the accountability about it, but not the names, and we refused it. We actually put a cautionary measure request in the Supreme Court because they were aggressively requesting that information. We promised our readers, we had e-meetings with many of the readers that were members at that moment, claiming them that we were not gonna give those information because that was their private information, and we promised them that we were going to go until the final consequences with that. Eventually, the Supreme Court claimed that was beyond fiscal interest, so we kind of won with a cautionary measure about it. So we keep thinking about institutional ways that, in a very extreme case where we are, for example, forbidden of collecting money or collecting members from becoming members of El Faro, to keep operating regardless the kind of government that we currently have.
And Pramesh, thank you, Carlos. Did you see any attempts of direct interference with your ability to collect audience revenue, or do you have any concerns for the future that your government may come up with some way like what Carlos described? And in Hungary, there was similar legislation proposed to say that all supporters of charitable organizations, their names should be disclosed. And obviously, this was aimed to discourage individual contributions, because people were like, oh my God, the government is going to know my name if I support an NGO that they don't like, and I don't want that. And I was wondering, do you face sort of similar threats in your environment?
Not at the moment. I think government has not, tried to, discourage subscription. Either they haven't got around to it, or they've been too busy doing other things. But who knows in the future? In fact, at the moment, if you subscribe to a online newspaper, you actually get a tax exemption, a tax discount. So that's actually good, because I think the entire media industry is suffering a crisis. So the government has been very lenient to support, their movement to online media. So not at the moment, but we'll have to wait and see what happens next.
And then one last question before we move into the audience questions. I was wondering if you, and you can start, Pramesh, and then we can move on to Carlos. When you look into the future and you sort of what keeps you up at night before you fall asleep finally, Bird is very exhausted from all the work. Is this more about the business of news, how you are going to remain profitable, be profitable, pay your bills and employees, or is it more about interference? Is it more about the politics, how the state may interfere with your work? Is the business of news or the politics of news that worries you more or concerns you more?
Well, it's kind of like, the politics is kind of like an earthquake. You never know when it's going to strike. I mean, it's quite devastating. Obviously, governments in a time of desperation will take harsh action, and we do not know when that will happen. Whereas, in terms of the business, it's always a slow attrition, right? It's a very slow decline, and I think that's more the medium to long-term problem. I think the biggest problem we see is that our age of our subscribers is, generally aging, and in fact, younger people are actually not visiting the website directly. They're much more into, getting their news on Instagram or whichever platform, WhatsApp, etc. They don't really link with a news brand. So we see this very strongly with those under 30 and even those under 35. So unless we are able to figure out a format where they're willing to pay for news, I think we'll be in trouble. They're obviously paying for content already. They subscribe to Netflix, to Spotify and other content services, but they are fairly reluctant to pay for news at this junction. They're much more entertainment focused, and they like to consume news in an entertaining format, whether it's a podcast or a video, and they don't really read long form, or even 10 paragraphs is considered long form for them. So I think that is the biggest medium to long term challenge that we're facing.
And just on this note, because I would be very curious to hear, this is not entirely unlike what we have here in Hungary. Do you have any ideas about how to, because for example, for us, video, we are strong in video, but it seems impossible to monetize it. And so I was wondering, do you have any sort of leads?
Well, we've seen a few countries succeed using news aggregator apps. There are a few very popular news aggregator apps. And some amount of payment in those apps. So I think that may be some formula that we're looking for, or other types of more convenient content. But I think that the other question is that in 5 to 8 years time, when these younger people are slightly older, the technology of which is going to change so drastically. I mean, 10 years ago, we hardly use smartphones, and today we are nearly all the time on our smartphones. And 10 years from now, the laptop or even smartphones may be very old. So I think that it is not just a question of how do we plan for that next 10 years. We don't even know what the next 10 years is going to be like. So I think now our key challenge is to build up competence, data competence, machine language competence, AI competence, so that we understand how to deliver the content as trends change. So we're investing a lot in engineering, in software development, in product development, to build those capacities in-house. So I think that is as important, because as platforms change, we will be able to adapt with the trend and hopefully be able to reach out to those key audiences as time goes by.
Thank you. And Carlos, to you, the same question. Do politics keep you up at night, or the business of news?
Currently, I wish just the business news kept me away, but last couple of months, I think obviously they are kind of related, but my nights have been more focused ultimately in just how to guarantee that in a very extreme case of abuse of power, we keep operating despite, for example, arbitrary detentions of our journalists or things like that. That gets me kind of awake. In terms of business side, kind of what Prem says. Our very loyal readers tend to be over the age of 45, actually, and that in the long run might be a problem, right? So we are wondering every day how to connect with people from lower range in terms of age, and we are doing it through two ways. Basically, we are trying to innovate in the formats. Besides not giving up to the long form journalism, we still publish very long form reportage and chronicles, but we're thinking about how to complement them with easily consumed articles, for example, audio, infographics, storytelling, and things like that. And the other thing that we are starting to do a lot is more dialogue spaces. We are opening different events online, obviously, at the moment, both like webinars like this one or Twitter Spaces, which is kind of very popular here in El Salvador, to answer any question about our journalism that any reader might have. Even though they might be uncomfortable question for us or critics, we are trying to receive it. Last week we did one, and we received a lot of questions, and we promised them to answer every one of them. And we think that eventually doing this on a daily basis will impact on the number of members and on how more younger people connect with us for the long run.
Thank you so much for both of you. And Ariel, could you help us with the questions from the audience? Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. This has been such an informative presentation. And Carlos's point actually brings up one question that I would like to ask before we move into the audience questions, which is, each of you are in some stage of sort of engaging with your audience more deeply and inviting audience questions. How do you balance that with potentially pressure from not just the government, but the public? How do you talk to your journalists about how to engage with the public when sometimes the public might also be abusive towards your journalists because of the political climate?
It's a very difficult dynamic. I think the audience interactions for the newsroom can be very tricky because we are subject to lots of trolling that we believe are organized. Sort of, these are not one-off things, but these are people who come to disrupt our communities. But then when you have lots of these interactions, some of the newsroom will be reluctant to connect with the audience because they have all these bad experiences. I think that since we created this closed forum, the closed Facebook group, and only people who supported us get an invitation, that is a very sort of good way to have a first filter. And then obviously there are still people who will, pay like $25 just for the opportunity to mess with us, but the numbers are a lot lower. And then it also has this effect that if you have a group of 7,000 people and there are 3 people or 4 people or even 10 people who are there to cause trouble, the community is sort of self-policing. When these people turn up, other members of the community, not from the newsroom, but other supporters, will sort of tell them, what they're thinking. It's mostly civil. It's still sometimes difficult to get people to interact. And I think it's also important for the members of the newsroom to know that they can, if they have a question that they don't know how to best answer, that they can always ask. And we have a system now that each month there's a different reporter in charge of the closed Facebook group, and we all go through the motions and we all become familiar. And then people realize there's a lot more positive interactions there, which I think is also important.
Thanks, Peter. Carlos or Prem, do you have any experience with that within your team?
Yeah, in our case, actually through the MPP fund this semester and the support of Javi, we got inspired by the Daily Mavericks experience, and we implemented like an internal newsletter, bi-monthly newsletter for just our team, where we try to explain them our audience strategy and the noise they might see in social media, what actually it means, right? In terms of numbers and in terms of interpretations. We are trying to tell them and to make them understand that like audience strategy go far beyond page views of our articles. And there are a lot of engaging metrics and a lot of qualitative information that we collect through surveys and things like that we use to try them to understand the path we're taking through our membership strategy. And every time we send a newsletter on Friday, on Monday on a general meeting with all the newsroom, we discuss it and solve their questions. So that's been key for our strategy last couple of months, because we are trying to that our newsroom engages more with that, because obviously they're very busy watching on the power, but it's very important for us that they become allies of our strategy in terms of membership.
Thanks, Carlos.
Yeah, I think we we have our big fans, and also groups which are obviously hostile, and they really comment a lot on Facebook. We have our own commenting section which is only for subscribers, and because subscriber is much more manageable. So we're kind of getting used to it. That we know that there are some people who will be very supportive, and some people will not like our stories, and it's just something that we live with.
Great. And the first question we've got from the audience, I'll actually combine them into two because they're both for Peter in regards to the research. Danny Stusser wants to know, for-profit versus nonprofit. Did you study the difference between the results achieved by these two kinds of organizations? And maybe, Peter, you can say a little bit about how that nonprofit versus for-profit distinction might be different. And the second question, it comes from Jill Shepard for Publica. And she wants to know, the organizations that had a paywall versus the organizations that did not, did you find that the organizations without a paywall pushed as aggressively for donations as the paywall organizations did with subscriptions? So are they as aggressive at asking for donations as they are for subscriptions, those that don't have paywalls?
The second question, unfortunately, is the easiest. I don't know. My gut feeling, talking to all these outlets, is that people who do subscriptions and paywalls do push more aggressively, and people who do donations are a bit more relaxed about it, for better or worse. For the first question, so what I found was, from the get-go, it was very interesting because while, and I'll need to pull up some data to be precise, but lots of these organizations, even the ones that were formerly for-profit, were for-profit with restrictions. So for example, a number of newsrooms had no dividend policies. And then a number of newsrooms had, while they were for-profit, they were owned by either key members of the newsroom or many members of the newsroom in the cooperative format. I think even the business setup echoed this sentiment, where the mission sort of seemed more important than the profit-making ability of the organization. The other, I think, very interesting branch of this story was also in Russia. Obviously, some of these things, because Russia was, again, one of the most oppressive environments that I researched, is that so the government there really cracked down on free press, forcing lots of outlets, to change their coverage or go defunct. And so there was this sort of vacuum. And then there were these charitable organizations in the market that were not news organizations at all. They were classic charities, NGOs raising money for certain goals, whatever, caring for sick children and things like that. And then they began publicizing their work as means to raise more donations. So they learned how to, write up their work so it's more enticing to the audience. But then they realized this was very effective. Some other charitable organization reached out and said, hey, you got so good at writing these up, will you help us write our stuff up? And then there was this point after which they began hiring editors and reporters instead of hiring, fundraisers or whoever else they had. And the organization moved from a purely sort of traditional charity to either this hybrid where they do lots of charitable work, but then regularly published long reads and reports about their work. But there were organizations that moved completely into the media space and became, I think, de facto newspapers. And I think this was because the regime was really oppressive. Some of the traditional media was driven out. There was this vacuum. And these organizations, I think it's important to note that they focused on sort of these social empathy stories. So they don't deal with corruption or direct abuses of power. They deal with societal issues, but things that the regime still allows them to cover or still allows to be discussed. And I think this was an interesting evolution in terms of like nonprofits. But in general, I think in these environments, being nonprofit or even being for-profit but with restrictions is pretty much the standard. But if you email me after, I can send you a more detailed sort of breakdown of results and business setup.
Yeah. I'm curious, each of you, what are each of your newsrooms? Are they for-profit or nonprofit?
we are for profit with restrictions. So we have a strict no dividend policy. Even when we are profitable, we have to reinvest everything to the no one's getting very rich.
Yeah, we're the same. We are for profit, but we have a no dividends policy, and we always complain that none of us get paid enough. So that's the reality.
And we are for profit as well, owned by our journalists in general, and we do not have a written policy, but as we have never made many profit, we have never delivered dividends.
This is one of the things that we talked about in the MPP opening yesterday is that for-profit, nonprofit distinction really doesn't change the sort of membership equation all that much. It actually leads me to a question, and we can still take questions from the audience. So please use the Q&A box if you have questions, people who are listening in. But I'm curious at MPP, when we interviewed members early on in MPP's work, one of the things we heard over and over from members about things that they valued was transparency around how you work and your financial situation. But those interviews were largely with members in the US and Western Europe. And so I'm curious for each of you who are in more challenging environments, what things feel comfortable for you to be transparent about and what things feel too risky? What things feel like they put you at risk if you share them too widely? And how do you navigate that with your members when they want to understand certain things that you think it might not be okay to disclose publicly?
This is a very divisive issue for us within the newsroom. I think we try to be as transparent as we can, but I think it's also important to choose the right time and the right sort of platform to communicate certain things. There is different, so you can say, oh, we are keeping something a secret as if we don't communicate it. I think that's usually not the best way to go, but I think there's a big difference between, let's say, communicating something with only the people who already support us, sending out an email to those people. And there's a different thing that when we publish it in the closed Facebook group, and then it's a whole different kind of openness to push it on the front page of the website. We reach different people. And I think we have to be mindful of the audience and the timing, but we try to be as transparent as we can. And also in Hungary, the regulation requires us to release our profit and loss and number of employees. So there's lots of information also out there that is freely available for everyone to see. Just one other note on this, and again, I'm circling back to Russia, sorry. It was very interesting when I was doing the research in Oxford. It was fairly easy to get people to talk from most of the countries about their media organizations and their audience revenue programs, even in fairly repressive environments. The only place I had consistent trouble with is when I tried to speak to media managers in Russia, because some of them just told me outright, it's too much of a risk talking to me, even if they don't see now how this can, fall back on them. And the whole of the study was anonymous. Like I didn't even reference countries in their only regions, but they said it's just too risky right now in Russia to open up about anything, because they don't know where this leads to, because this spring, there was a new wave of crackdown, and it's still ongoing. Every day you hear news about a new news organization being designated a foreign agent, a new organization, being raided by police. So I understand why they were hesitant.
In the case of El Faro, our ownership and revenue streams are public, and more detail when we send the onboarding newsletter cycle for the new members. It's the second newsletter we send, like after people has 15 days of being a member, they receive like a very detailed explanation about who owns El Faro and how we found ourselves. I think the difference is regarding the public. We are very, 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 very detailed when we talk with members, and moreover, when we talk in a meeting with them. And we are very transparent in general terms for the public, but the main details are kept for the members. But the most important information is on the homepage of El Faro in general for everybody.
Yeah, we're generally pretty transparent about our finances, about our staffing, how we do, about our ownership. There's really no big secrets about Malaysia Kini. We don't react to every accusation just because we don't want to be seen to be reactive, but we try to put as much as possible about ourselves on our website.
Just one note on that. This is, again, something we do. Our ownership, like every month, there is some way that it's being called into question who owns 444, in whose interest. And what happened is that our editor-in-chief wrote a fairly good article in 2017. There was some situation there where we felt that we needed to address this. And ever since then, we just reference there. So if someone asks, we say, hey, look, we published this in 2017. Everything we said in there is still true. So I think it's very important what Premesh said. You can't engage every time because these questions are brought up specifically to discredit you, and they are talking again about who owns them. There must be something fishy there. I think it's very important to publish these things, publish them once, and then just point people to, hey, you can see it here and read it, and not constantly engage with these things.
Thank you. And we have one question from the audience, I think is an important one for us to just answer very quickly before we move on to the next one. Do you have members from outside your country? I know for at least 444 and El Faro that members outside of your countries are actually a very important part of your work. Want to say a little bit more about that?
Yes, like 75 to 70% of our members are from El Salvador. The rest are from abroad, specifically mainly from the United States, because there's a large Salvadorian community and Central American community in the US. And what we have found that despite we have more members from El Salvador, the average annual contribution in general is higher and bigger from people who are in the US. And we think it's for obvious reasons.
Yeah, I think it's very similar to us. People outside of Hungary tend to have more purchasing power. And also, and I know this is venturing into pop psychology, so sorry for that. But what happens is people leave a country because of economic circumstances, because they are searching for a better life. Maybe the political environment plays some role to it, although I doubt that's the only reason. Usually it's part of the reasons. But then they do feel guilty about having a life somewhere else, having a better life. And I think one way to keep connected with Hungary is for them to read 444 and to support 444. And this is how they get their information. And what we do is we don't have services specifically for them, but we do try to promote what we do, sometimes even with paid promotion that is geared toward, for example, on Facebook, you can target Hungarian speakers, but in London or Berlin or the US for that matter. And we do that, and we do see good results because, as Carlos pointed out, these people tend to have more money, and definitely more money to spend on frivolous stuff like free media.